Ladies and gentlemen, today I will be speaking on the topic of physician-assisted suicide. If a suicidal man came up to you, pleading for you to end his life, would you hand him a gun? It would seem absurd to hand him a gun, but we see now that there is a large acceptance of this thinking. However, instead of being handed a gun, he is handed a lethal amount of pills by a doctor. With guidelines, this is known as physician-assisted suicide. Terminally ill patients may choose this option if they wish to die on their own terms. Assisted suicide came about as an act of compassion and sympathy for the dying, something that we can all understand. Personally, I have struggled with this topic, as I have an understanding of why a dying, suffering patient would choose this option. But it is important to acknowledge that assisted suicide is a dangerous and slippery slope. Perhaps this story will express what I cannot. This is Hilary St. Pierre. She stood against assisted suicide as she was faced with her own battle against a terminal cancer. Her view began to shift as she declared, "After years of treatment and the label of incurable, I too wanted to have some control. Everything had been taken from me. I could not walk more than a few steps. I could not breathe without oxygen. I could no longer play with my son or do the things I loved. I became a burdensome blob, only capable of sitting on the couch. I felt like a parasite, always taking and never contributing. I wanted to relieve my family of the stress they had been feeling for years. I wanted them to go on with their lives without the stress of me on their shoulders, and I wanted to stop suffering. I'd had enough. I was ready to die." I believe this is how most people feel when faced with assisted suicide. She chose to decline assisted suicide, and a year and a half later wrote in her blog, "Had I set up an appointment, the outcome may have been different. I would have felt obligated to follow through. I would have had a sense of there's no going back. If it is easy and convenient, like a scheduled assisted suicide, people are more likely to follow through. This may be the reason the dying kill themselves, the inclination and the convenience." The idea of physician-assisted suicide has been addressed in the 4th century BC in the Hippocratic Oath, in which physicians would state, "I will not give a lethal drug to anyone if I am asked, nor will I advise such a plan." This statement was later removed along with parts against abortion. The idea of assisted suicide was not widely practiced or addressed until Australia legalized assisted suicide in 1995, and the Netherlands, Switzerland, Belgium, others were quick to follow. However, Australia revoked the law 2 years after passing it because it allowed the intentional killing of a human being. In 1997, Oregon was the first U.S. state to allow assisted suicide. As of now, Washington, Montana, Vermont, our home state California, and Oregon all allow assisted suicide. Dr. Jack Kevorkian was the man who began the assisted suicide movement in the United States. He is known as Dr. Death due to his obsession with death and his widely known suicide machine called the Thanatron. This device was used to kill patients painlessly while injecting a painkiller and a lethal dose of potassium chloride into the victim. He was eventually subject to 25 years in prison as Michigan outlawed assisted suicide. Before he died, he claimed to have taken 130 lives, including those of mental illnesses. With such a law now legal, it is important to understand the various ways in which these end-of-life circumstances are carried out. The first is active euthanasia, in which the doctor injects a lethal dose of medication into the patient, and the other is passive euthanasia, which is the process of withholding or withdrawing medications that are necessary to maintain life. Interestingly enough, in the United States, euthanasia is illegal in all 50 states. It is only assisted suicide that has found its way into America's legal system, and it is ironically a form of euthanasia. In assisted suicide, the responsibility of the death is shifted to the patient, as the doctor prescribes a lethal dose of barbiturates and sends the patient home to carry out the deed. In euthanasia, the doctor is the one who injects the lethal medication. Euthanasia is actually considered manslaughter, which is the key reason why Dr. Jack Kevorkian was charged with murder. This specific point has caught my attention. The United States will acknowledge euthanasia as murder, yet will tolerate assisted suicide solely because of the legalities of who administers the drug. The process of assisted suicide in the United States begins with the patient's primary physician. The requirements to receive an okay from the doctor is being terminally ill, have 6 months or less to live, have 2 oral requests made as well as a written one, be free from depression or any other mental state that may affect the decision, participate in a psychological evaluation, alternatives must be addressed, and the patient must be 18 years or older. 2 physicians of the patient's choice must be present in order to approve that all the criteria is met. The issue here is that these patients like to doctor shop, which is the process of finding a doctor who would approve of your situation. If a doctor tells the patient that they are not eligible, that patient can go and find a doctor who approves. And once approved, the doctor will distribute a lethal amount of barbiturates, which is about 100 pills, to the patient. If the patient changes his or her mind about taking the pills, the patient must dispose of the pills properly and take them to a take-back program at the pharmacy. Once the decision is made, he or she must break open each of the 100 capsules and pour them into a solution, usually juice. After about 5 minutes, the solution will put the patient to sleep, and within about 30 minutes, the patient will be dead. However, this is only the desired situation. In specific circumstances, patients have experienced extreme gasping and muscle spasms, as well as vomiting followed by inhaling that vomit. And if not given enough barbiturates, the patient will only experience a coma, waking up a few days after taking these pills. Panic attacks and seizures have occurred as well. This is not the picture most people see when thinking of death with dignity, and it is a quite gruesome death. In the Netherlands, 7% of assisted suicide attempts were met with this extreme gasping and vomiting. 14% underwent a coma, and 18% experienced other problems. Although these are low percentages, please acknowledge that the Netherlands have had thousands upon thousands of euthanasia and assisted suicide circumstances. The issue with assisted suicide is that in America, the idea seems to save us from the one thing virtually all Americans fear most, a difficult death. However, we must look to the countries who experienced the trial and error, and the Netherlands should be a shining example of that escalation and horror. The Netherlands started out in 1981 with strict guidelines grew smaller and smaller. Within 9 years after the law took place, 2,300 people were killed by voluntary euthanasia, 400 killed using assisted suicide, and 1,041 people were killed with no consent, with only 14% of those conscious. Because of this large use of euthanasia, there are very poor hospice care systems in the Netherlands, leading assisted suicide to be the best option. In fact, the Netherlands make assisted suicide very accessible through a clinic called the Life Ending Clinic, which is solely dedicated to the very purpose of its name. And about 10,000 citizens in the Netherlands have "Do Not Euthanize Me" written on their living wills. The United States is no less horrific. In Oregon, where assisted suicide has been legal since 1997, there were 341 reported assisted suicides in the first 10 years. 20 of these 341 instances resulted in gruesome vomiting or simply a coma. These, of course, are only the reported situations. The larger issue with assisted suicide is that the doctor is usually not present during the actual death. In fact, in only about 21% of the deaths were the physicians actually present. How then can the physician report back that there was no complication? The answer is that they cannot, and the state of Oregon allows them to declare that unknown. The social issue is perhaps the most frightening of all. and is seen perfectly through the Netherlands as well. There is a huge loss of medical trust among the elderly, as well as escalations of pressures, and these pressures to feel like a burden are overpowering. I interviewed a man in Yuba City during my research, and he proved this point perfectly. When asked personally if he would use the assisted suicide option, he said, very hesitantly, "If I was terminally ill and using up all of my finances, yes, I would, because I would not want to drain our wife of our financial resources." It seems like a selfless motive, and it really is. But the very fact that assisted suicide could potentially be used because one feels that he or she is just a burden simply diminishes the value that we hold in the life of a human being. The right to die quickly becomes the duty to die. It is also the cheaper option compared to any other treatment, which is why this man said he would choose this option. But for those not desiring assisted suicide, it becomes a nightmare. Barbara Wagner and Randy Stroop, both living in Oregon, were faced with the same situation when diagnosed with terminal cancers. They received a letter in the mail in which Wagner declared, it basically said that if you want to take the pills, we will help you get that from the doctor and we will stand there and watch you die. But we won't give you the medication to help you live. To sum that story up, the healthcare system of Oregon offered to kill a patient rather than to do everything possible to save the life of a human being. This is happening here in the United States. That could be one of your family members being denied chemotherapy. Perhaps one of the largest arguments to support assisted suicide is the matter of choice. But as Barbara Wagner put it, what sort of choice is it when life is expensive but death is free? Throughout the history of euthanasia, the majority of Christian churches oppose this concept to the full extent. The mainline Protestant Church and Roman Catholic Church view euthanasia as murder and suicide, and it is therefore contrary to God's law. The Orthodox Church declares that it is against their pro-life stance, and the Nazarene Church states that it violates confidence in God as sovereign Lord of life. The verse that is commonly used to refute against euthanasia is Exodus 20:13, in which the sixth commandment, do not kill, is stated. To many, euthanasia is considered murder on the part of the physician, but the United States has attempted to escape that claim on the physician by only allowing assisted suicide, in which the physician simply enables the patient to bring forth death. In 1 Corinthians 3:16-17, it addresses the fact that we are God's temple, and by committing suicide, we dishonor our duty to take care of our bodies as His temple. It is our job to glorify God in everything we do, including our death. A Catholic woman suffering from colon cancer was interviewed on CNN about assisted suicide, and she declared that she wanted to use assisted suicide because she did not believe in a God that would want her to struggle and suffer to death. But God does allow these circumstances. All of the apostles, except for John, suffered an extremely gruesome death, yet they honored God until the very end. In an interview with Pastor Gary Moore about the Nazarene Church belief on euthanasia, he made a profound statement saying, "I think personally, I would give more attention to the statement, euthanasia attaches too much importance on the cessation or absence of suffering. I know this is a very unpopular thought in the American culture. Many people, even among those who claim to be followers of Jesus, try and formulate the scriptures to formulate a God who eliminates suffering. As Christians, we should find honor in suffering as Christ did." A long and painful death is a concept virtually all Americans wish to escape. Assisted suicide appeals to so many due to the fact that it saves us from suffering at the end of our lives. But we simply cannot give in to the ideology that the option of a hastened death will solve the problem. We must look to options of life, such as better palliative and hospice care, giving the patients what they need to die in comfort. We cannot neglect the dying and simply offer them death. Hospice care provides care, comfort, and support for persons with life-limiting conditions. The hospice team works to make the person comfortable, as well as relieve their symptoms and pain for the entire length of their illness. In the United States, There is only about 1 palliative care physician per every 1,200 patients that have a serious illness, and only 63% of hospitals actually have a palliative care program. Rather than investing into assisted suicide, we should look to improve the care of the terminally ill. The second step includes focusing on these patients' mental state. Most of these patients suffer from depression, loneliness, and other mental illnesses, which has much to do with their choosing of assisted suicide. The claim is that assisted suicide allows the suffering to die with dignity. But there is no dignity in death. No matter how death is met, we lose our dignity as we are overcome by death itself. I would like to show you a video of a father who was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer, yet chose to say no to assisted suicide.
One of the, if not the deadliest form of brain cancer that exists. The neurosurgeon who conducted the biopsy said that the cancer was inoperable. You have 4 months to live. In a best case scenario, you may get a year.
And that was it. He walked away.
When a week before that, you were running, you were having fun, you were hanging out with your kid and your wife, you were working, and everything seemed fine. And all of a sudden, a man comes in and says, "You're gonna die." You don't just accept it because someone said it. We had one doctor that told us that, "Go home, enjoy the time you have left." And yet another doctor said, "We got this, no problem, we'll get it out."
He had the surgery at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and he had an amazing neurosurgeon. They monitored to see if he was having seizures that we just couldn't see. Over the next 24 hours, he had 9 more seizures. So by the time that was done, he couldn't talk at all.
Would this be easier if I just gave up? If I just said, this is too much of a burden on my family, the pain is difficult, I don't want to deal with this. What if I just said I had enough and ended it? I would be okay the next day because I would be gone. I wouldn't feel the pain, I wouldn't feel the emotion. They do. My wife would feel it for the rest of her life. My son would not have one more day to spend with me.
No matter how bad those days were, we had to fight for James. James makes us stronger.
I still have cancer today. I still have active cancer cells. I'm still on chemo. And I have people say all the time, "You don't look like it. You don't look like you have active cancer." It's because every single part of my day I spend towards improving my ability to live. I followed the Brittany Maynard case. To a certain extent, I could identify with what she was dealing with. Same disease, roughly the same age, both had families, but I don't agree with what she chose to do. You can't unmake that choice. Once you do it, it's done.
The man in this video, J.J. Hansen, said this: "I was told you don't have an option. You can die dignified if you commit suicide." Whoa, wait a second. The whole terminology is flipping on its head. If you give up and you don't fight, somehow you're compassionate and dignified. But if you want to fight and you want to live, you lack compassion and dignity. To me, this just doesn't make sense. It's kind of a reflection of where our society is. J.J. Hansen said it perfectly. What kind of dignity is shown through this father taking his life because he wishes to die on his own terms? Those remaining months of precious life are so critical to his child. The true value and dignity of life are seen in this instance, that a father would fight endlessly to be with his wife and his child, that he would suffer and endure pain to spend every moment with those he loves, that he would sacrifice an easy death for the sake of his family. Thank you. My assistants will pass out the brochures that have the next steps that you can take. Are there any questions?